Hi everyone, I'm Perry Gilbert Reed and I'm here to discuss my project proposal development on spiritual bypass as a form of spiritual abuse. I will cover the grant title and number, budget, strategic plan, public benefits, scientific rationale, specific aims, significant challenges, and end with my references. The grant title that I chose was Research Grants for Preventing Violence and Violence-Related Injury. Now, this may seem like an odd one for my proposal. However, the reason this grant works for my study area is that spiritual abuse is a form of violence-related injury, and I'll go into more of that a little bit later. But the research has shown that abusive partners will often use spiritual components to manipulate, coerce, and control their partner through mediums such as emotional, mental, physical abuse. So when you add the spiritual components into that and you use scripture and spiritual constructs to control, that becomes spiritual abuse. Here is my budget. Although the budget did not include some items that might be in a non-dissertation type study, I did go ahead and at least mention the principal investigator part of the budget, but I do recognize that in a non-dissertation budget, there will be more items that would be listed in there, and the budget would most likely be higher. My strategic plan aligns and supports Liberty University's strategic plan. It supports the unique culture and effective leadership mentioned within Liberty's strategic plan. As I study spiritual bypass as a form of spiritual abuse, it will allow the unique faith-based culture that Liberty mentions to gain more insight into this topic. In addition, it will help leaders in ministry, leaders in nonprofit ministry, anything that has a spiritual construct to it. It can help those leaders to know more about spiritual bypass and spiritual abuse and know how to implement interventions so that that doesn't occur. I did initially want to do one with Barna, but I never could find their strategic plan, and Barna does do a lot of research in faith-based constructs and leadership. The public benefit, it will help clergy as well as other leaders in spiritual constructs to navigate this topic. In addition, it will help survivors of interpersonal violence abuse. The proposed project will help develop the body of knowledge for spiritual bypass as a form of spiritual abuse. Right now, this literature is sparse in this area. You can find some literature on spiritual abuse, some on spiritual bypass, but the two together, there is none. Also, going back to interpersonal violence and abuse lends its support to the idea that men who act abusively can and do use religion to legitimize their actions. And it's not just men. Of course, women can be those abusers as well. The other public benefit is the introduction of the V code. I didn't know this existed until I was doing work for another paper and realized that there is a V code in the back of the DSM. And those V codes, of course, are codes that are being looked at for possible use or implementation into the next DSM. And this one is the religious and spiritual problem. And it's expanded an option for a differential diagnosis to emotional abuse, mental abuse, because the spiritual abuse does hit someone on a whole nother level. And because we are spiritual beings, because we know that even those who are non-religious tend to have a spiritual core to them, they often don't know how to navigate this concept of spiritual abuse. It defines more how spiritual abuse can occur, such as through spiritual bypass, and can lend spiritual abuse more credence as a form of abuse, allowing people to receive healing from such. And if this were to become a diagnosis in the DSM, then of course it could possibly get compensation, or counselors could get compensation for that. In addition, with the training, this explores spiritual bypass as a form of spiritual abuse. More clergy and spiritual leaders and counselors can receive training. Within many counseling programs that are non-religious in their implementation, they don't really spend a lot of time on spirituality. Even those that are religious may not spend a lot of time on how to conduct interventions that will be specific to spiritual abuse or spiritual bypass. But what this allows in the training is, no matter the counseling program, CACREP can implement those. Right now, there is one sentence within CACREP that allows that, that speaks to spirituality in and of itself. However, it would be nice if there were more in there that CACREP can lean on, as well as ACERVIC. ACERVIC has 14 components to it in speaking to spirituality within the person. But again, making the training more solidified with spirituality as a component. Scientific rationale, my objectives expand the definition of spiritual abuse. Right now, there's a little bit over here and a little bit over here, and each hits on each time more information is gathered about spiritual abuse. It expands, and so I would like to see that definition expand even more with the things that I have gathered from not only my personal experience with spiritual abuse, but also as I have been in trainings dealing with spirituality. The questions that come up is partly due to the fact that the definition doesn't speak to whether it's covert or overt, whether it can happen in just a church or other religious establishments. And then, of course, spiritual bypass as a component to that. Also, to revise a spiritual bypass self-report to assess for spiritual bypass by another individual. Right now, there is the Spiritual Bypass Scale 13 that was developed by Dr. Jesse Fox. However, it is particular to how an individual uses spiritual bypass for him or herself. And spiritual bypass, by definition, is when we use spirituality to avoid necessary psychological tasks for healing. And so, being able to show, that would have to be revised to be able to show how another individual can actually use spiritual bypass to impede another spiritual growth, or use it as a tool for control and coercion and manipulation. To assess if spiritual bypass is a form of spiritual abuse, and that too would come through multiple questionnaires to determine the links to that. The significance of this subject in my field is important for the following reasons. This is by Gerald Corey. Spirituality and religion are critical sources of strength for many clients and are a bedrock for finding meaning in life, as well as instrumental in promoting healing and well-being. We simply can't ignore the spiritual components to counseling, to the person as a whole. We know that spirituality is a part of our core components. The reason, again, that more research is needed in this area is because we are spiritual beings. Lack of spirituality in counseling programs, and then limitations. The previous research conducted on spiritual abuse and spiritual bypass has had limitations. A lot with spiritual abuse has been that it hasn't been quantified, whereas spiritual bypass has had some quantitative studies done on that. So there is also no current literature where spiritual bypass is shown as a form of spiritual abuse. Here is my proposed research method. I would like to conduct a mixed methods design with quantitative and qualitative information. The quantitative would be to survey participants to identify if spiritual abuse has occurred. That can come from a spiritual abuse questionnaire. This was actually developed by Dr. Catherine Keller. In addition, use the spiritual bypass scale. First, that was developed by Dr. Jesse Fox, but from there, I would like to revise that survey to incorporate whether another individual has used spiritual bypass as a form of coercion, manipulation, or control. The qualitative would come in with a semi-structured interview where people could express their experiences, and then I can be able to distinguish if they are understanding spiritual bypass and spiritual abuse, give more clarity to those surveys. My specific aims: I can clarify the definition of spiritual abuse, to revise a spiritual bypass assessment, and then, of course, to determine if spiritual bypass is a form of spiritual abuse. In clarifying the definition, this will help develop thorough understanding of spiritual bypass for leaders, parishioners, or counselors. And revising the spiritual bypass assessment, a current self-report assessment for spiritual bypass, as I stated previously, does exist, but it's only for how one uses that on themselves as a coping tool. However, it does not assess for whether an individual has experienced spiritual bypass from another individual. Therefore, I would like to create a revised self-report measure that does allow for us to investigate whether it can be noticed by another individual doing that to someone else as a form of spiritual abuse. And then to determine if spiritual abuse is a form, spiritual bypass is a form of spiritual abuse, using my clarified definition with the revised self-report assessment, along with a valid measure to investigate whether spiritual bypass is a form of spiritual abuse. I hypothesize that there is a direct association between spiritual bypass and spiritual abuse. Significant challenges of this proposed project: surveys. I've noticed in the literature that many surveys, when they are self-report measures, often are not always truly reflective of the participants' experiences. Sometimes that's due to biases. Sometimes that's due to religiously social acceptable responses. That's noticed in the second challenge there. They may respond out of what keeps the guilt away. I feel guilty about answering this that way, so I'm going to answer this instead. As I mentioned, biases can come in. And then generalizability is another limitation that I've noticed within the literature, that depending on where the sample comes from, cannot be generalized as a whole. Here are my references. And I hope that overall this has made sense and you've been able to see my long-term goal as well as my short-term goals as well. Thank you for listening.